This week, number 20, is now our second part on forms. And in the first part, in last week, we have in particular discussed the input element. It was quite extensive, and for the input element, we have, for example, fields. We have, for example, a slider, something to check. We have some buttons which open a window in which we can make a selection. So all these different input types that we have gone over, all of that data is always intended to go to the server. And in this week, there are two more elements that we are now discussing, whose data is also intended to go to the server. And that is the text area, first of all. Whatever we insert in here is intended to go to the server ultimately. And then there is a menu which we are taking a look at, and whatever we select inside that menu is intended to go to the server. And then there are a couple of other elements that we are discussing that whose data will not be sent to the server. However, they are related to form elements, so therefore we are discussing them. For example, one of which we actually have already discussed in last week, which was the title, or better said, the label, which is the meaningful element when we are using a title for a certain form element. So that's the label element, but the label itself, his data, of course, will not be sent to the server. So therefore, these elements relate to forms, but their data still doesn't go to the server. For example, there are two more structural elements that we are taking a look at, which provide this structure right here, as we can see, to divide forms up. And then there are also a couple of other elements that are linked, that can be linked to other form elements, in particular to input fields, as we will see later. So whose data will still not be sent to the server, but they are interconnected with some form elements. So those ones we are taking a look at. And then once we have gone over these different elements, then we are going into the submission process in the second half of this week, where we are discussing everything in regards to how the data goes to the server and how it can reach the destination. Let's get started now, and the first thing that we are now discussing is our text area element. And this one is very similar to our input fields, because what we are having here is also a field in which we can enter multiple lines of text. So that is a major difference that we are having right here. And because it is so similar to the input fields that we have taken a look at, therefore it also shares quite a number of attributes that also we have seen already in regards to the input element. And we will very briefly go over a couple of them, but not in detail anymore, because we have seen them in last week. What we of course will be doing, we will be taking a look at the attributes that are specific to the text area. Those ones we are going further into detail. First of all, now one of which we are familiar with is the placeholder. So here we have seen, in regards to the input field, it's just a substitution for a title. And then as soon as the person starts typing, that placeholder disappears. And that is something that we can also give to our text area, since we are also dealing with a field here. And next one is autofocus. So we can make the text area also to have immediate focus once the page is loaded, meaning so that the browser's cursor is immediately inside here, so that the person can immediately start typing inside that field. And then there is also autocomplete. So what we can allow the browser is always to whether we allow him to store the data that is being entered, the text that is being entered inside that field, so that the browser can reuse that text later on when the same text area field is filled out again. And therefore it can autocomplete then this input ultimately once it has stored that text already inside its browser. And then there is disabled and read-only. Those ones we have seen as well. They are kind of similar in terms of that whatever is written inside here, once we disable or make it read-only our field, then the text that is already inside here, for example, cannot be deleted, or we can also not add additional text. So it's completely disabled from being modified. The difference, however, between disabled and read-only is that when it is disabled, then the browser's cursor cannot be concentrated inside here. And secondly, and most importantly, I would argue, of course, is that its data will not be sent over to the server. We will later see that the message here inside here is not the only thing that is sent to the server. There is also an association, better said a key basically, that indicates what this who this message belongs to, which element. And that key is actually the point which is not being sent over, the name that we will later give to the text area. We will take a closer look later on, but that is the key difference between disabled and read-only. His data will not be sent over to the server once we are setting the element to be disabled. And once we are applying the read-only attribute, then not the disabled, then the browser first of all can still put his cursor inside here, and secondly his data will still be sent over to the server. And then there are 3 validation attributes that we have seen in last week. And validation is always the browser once we are submitting the form or are trying to submit the form, and then the browser is checking all our form elements whether the input is valid that we have provided. And when that is not the case, then the browser will display a message underneath the element that is invalid, indicating to the user, hey, that and that is wrong inside that field, which you have to remedy. And that, for example, is when the user does not insert or select anything, even though it is required. So we can also make it required in these regards. Hey, something needs to be inserted here, otherwise you cannot submit the form. Then we can determine a certain minimum length or a maximum length of characters that are supposed to be entered inside that field. And again, when this is not met, the validation turns false, and therefore the form cannot be submitted and a message will show up. So that as brief repetition, let's go into the actual attributes that are new to us, and that is rows and columns, cols in short. And here we are determining the size of the text area in regards to something. And so that in regards, let's take a look at this one. For example, let's take a look at rows. So we are now determining how many rows shall be visible, how high the text area shall be in terms of how many rows shall be visible without a scroll bar being attached. And once we now enter some further data here, after the 6th row, there will be a scroll bar coming in order so we can go further down. But that is exactly what we are determining by using this attribute. And the difference in terms of doing that in CSS is because it is, once again, it is irrespective of what we are defining in CSS in terms of font size that we are using, in terms of padding that we are applying on top here or at the bottom, in terms of line height that we are defining for the text inside here. So irrespective of that, it will always make the text area as high, the browser will make it as high, so that at least 6 rows will be visible without a scroll bar being attached. So that's the difference than doing that in CSS by just giving it a height or a height. And now the cols, of course, we may have guessed it already, is of course determining the width now, but also once again in regards to something. And that is in regards to how many characters shall be visible, can go in here in one line without having to go into the next line. And one column is referred to as one character. So in this case, let's for example go for 40 columns, meaning 40 characters. And now the browser guarantees us, it gives us a width for that text area, so that at least 40 characters fit inside here without us having to go into another line. And that attribute is directly related to now another attribute, and that is actually an attribute that is in charge, or that has to do with the submission. It is the wrap attribute. But because it is directly related to this cols attribute, that's why we are discussing it now straight away. And that wrap attribute determines, we can tell the browser whether we want a line break, whether we want him to add a line break after every number of characters that we are defining by using the cols attribute. And by meaning adding a line break, so what the browser will do after 40 characters, it will enter the HTML entity that represents this line break. Same as white spaces cannot really be represented, so there are always these HTML entities, for example also the copyright symbol, we have seen it already, so that is exactly what we can achieve by using these HTML entities. So what the browser is doing is, it's the end symbol, the hash pound symbol, and then it's 10 and the semicolon, so that is what the browser will insert after every 40th character. Now a white space of course is also a character. So meaning when we are therefore writing a message, and let's for example assume that this is the salutation, and then we are breaking into a second line, so this one we leave empty, and then we write something, and then we want to do a new paragraph, for example. So that is exactly the format that we can reproduce, that we can then see on the server exactly in that format, in that structure, how the message was inserted. We ultimately have it on the server as well, due to that feature, the wrap attribute. And that is achieved because after every 40th or after every number of line break, one of those HTML entities is being entered, and that includes whitespace. So 40 characters, that's whitespace here, it will be entered. Now 40 characters of whitespace, it will be entered again, and so on. So that gives us now exactly that structure on the server if we want to keep that structure. Otherwise, what the browser will do, it will just remove the line breaks, and it will kind of send it in a compact form without any structure. So that is the control that we have, and by using exactly this wrap attribute. Now the default value that is being used here is soft, and this does not add these line breaks. So we need to turn that value, we need to change it to the value hard, and that is exactly now where the browser will then enter those line breaks after every number of character determined by the value for the colds attribute. So that is what the text area is in terms of HTML. There are 3 more attributes we are discussing in the second part of this week, which directly are relating to the submission process. It's the same that the input and the button element have as well. It's the name, the value, and the form. So those ones we are going over later on. And now let's take a look at the CSS part of the text area. And it's the same as in last week in regards to our field-like input elements. We really have full control of how we want the text area to look like. So what I have here are just a couple of random settings, random properties and values, CSS rules. And so just that we can see we really have full control on how we want our text area to look like. So nothing special to keep in mind here in regards to the CSS part. And then in addition now there is actually a certain functionality being applied on the text area. And that is where we are now introducing a new property, and that is the resize property. The resize property, however, is not fully supported, so the Microsoft browsers are not supporting it, and neither is currently at this given stage right now. It is neither being supported by iOS Safari. But all the other browsers, what they do, they attach an icon at the bottom right corner of the text area. And this icon, once we are hovering over it with the mouse, and then the cursor of the mouse is already changing, to which we have control over by using the cursor property. And here it's indicating to us, hey, you can actually resize that text area either horizontally as well as vertically. And that is exactly the control that is given to us due to that property that exists here. And the default value that's used, at least for the text area, is both. Meaning we can resize it horizontally and vertically. And now what we can do, we can also do that individual, so only horizontal. That is another value that we can use here. And the other one is vertical. So we can tell the browser, hey, only allow that box to be resized vertically. Horizontally is not possible now anymore. And now the fourth and the last value, just to finish this property here, is none. And that, of course, as the name implies. So now we are not able to resize that element anymore. Now this resize property we can not only apply, now it's the case that it is being applied on the text area by default. However, we can also make use of that property and apply it, for example, on images, on videos, on iframes, and also on any boxes that are block or inline block. But in regards to boxes, block and inline block, what we need to pay attention to here is the overflow. The value for the overflow property cannot be visible. And that's the value that is there by default. So overflow, whenever our content is larger than the height of the element, it will overflow, and it will by default overflow. It will be visible, the overflowing content. So we need to set it to scroll or hidden, one of those values. And then we can also apply the resize, get the resize functionality for these boxes as well. So that is our first property that we have introduced now. There is a second one coming in a moment in regards to our next form element whose data will also be sent over to the server. And here we are dealing with a menu in which there are a couple of options, so-called options or list items basically inside, among which we can make a selection from. And that is exactly how these elements are being called. So we are dealing here with a container box. So that's the select element. And inside here are the individual options that comprise the list, are the individual list items basically. And this option element here we can see it's a closing element, and the content, whatever is inside here, is the actual content of the list item. Now this select element also has a couple of attributes that we are familiar with. First of all, again, we can make the browser to immediately focus that element when the page is loaded. Let's do that actually for a moment, because here we are not dealing with a field, so we can once again see what the browser's cursor is actually being referred to. Now I have just reloaded the page. Now I can hit the space or the enter key in order to open the list, and we can navigate through that list immediately by using our arrow keys on the keyboard. So that is what we can do without having to navigate using our mouse. It has immediate focus. We can immediately make a selection inside here once we are applying this autofocus attribute, this Boolean attribute that does not need any value. Either we specify it or we do not. And then again, we can disable an entire menu, so no selection can be made inside here. In terms of validation, what we can do, we can make it required, meaning so a selection must be made. Otherwise, when the form is being submitted, the browser will validate that field, that select menu to false, tell the user in form of a message, hey, you did not make a selection here, make one, otherwise you cannot submit the form. And now there are two more attributes that we actually have seen in last week, and that is the size and the multiple attribute. With this, however, we will now be taking a look at them a little bit more closely in regards now to the select element. And that is first of all the multiple attribute. And that multiple attribute we have, for example, applied on the input type email and also on the input type file, so that the user can then, by holding down his control key, he can then select multiple files which will then be attached, ready for being uploaded. So of course that's what multiple is referring to. However, at this given point here we are having a menu that is being represented as a drop-down. Meaning, once we are doing a selection, the drop-down menu will close. Therefore, at this given point we cannot hold down the control key in order to make a second selection. Doesn't work. So therefore, what will change now once we are applying this multiple Boolean attribute right here? The drop-down menu, the look, will change from a drop-down menu to a scrollable menu. In order to give us that feature, now we can hold down the control key and can make multiple selections inside among these options that are inside the select element. So that is what the multiple is referring to here, what changes it does in terms of the menu. And we have now control over how high that menu is by using the size attribute. Now we have seen the size attribute in last week in regards to our input element. We determined the width in respect to how many characters shall be visible without one disappearing. Now what we are defining here now by using that size attribute, we are defining the height in terms of how many options shall be visible without the user having to scroll. For example, let's go for the number of 3. And now 3 options are visible and the fourth one we need to scroll to. And of course, once again, this is irrespective of what we are defining in CSS in terms of how much padding we are putting on top and bottom of each option, for example, how much font size we are using, how great the font size is, or for example, the line height. So irrespective of those CSS settings, the browser will always make our menu here as high as we determine it by our number, irrespective of those CSS settings. So that is what we can achieve by using our select elements. And again, because it will be sent to the server, it has this name and the form attribute that we are taking a look at later on in the second part. And then also the option is children, the individual options, there is actually the value. So here we can see name, value, form. The input is having those as well, and the button as well, as we will see later. And here again, it's name, form, and here the value is actually given to the options. And that's the element that we are now going into. So these are the children inside here, and the individual options can also be disabled, so only individual ones, so that they cannot be selected anymore. And in terms of selected, we can also make a certain option to be automatically by default be selected when the page is loaded by using exactly that Boolean attribute right here without a value selected. And now once we are reloading the page, exactly that eBay in this case is now being selected by default. So by default, therefore we can also, in regards to here, for those option elements that are selected by default, they also react to that pseudo class selector default. One we have seen in last week for our checkboxes and radio buttons that were checked by default, that had the checked attribute been given to it. So in this case, it's the options that have the selected attribute been given to it. Those ones we can select by using this pseudo selector. And the last one now is the label, and that is something specific in this regards, completely specific to sight disabled people. Let's, for example, assume that we use a screen reader which are used by sight disabled people. And such a screen reader includes a voice that talks to those sight disabled people. Whatever content is there is being spoken to them. And let's assume that we are inside this menu, and now this voice is telling us, hey, this option is http:// etc. So this part of the URL in this case is completely unnecessary. So irrespective, when we are having a list that has a shorter version that makes it easier for sight disabled people to make the selection, then we should go for the label attribute. So it's much more pleasant for them to then listen to that voice if we in this case, for example, only would supply xquick. And now the user, the voice would only say xquick instead of that entire part, and Bing and eBay, Amazon, etc. So much more comfortable, much more pleasant for those people. Whenever it is possible, when it makes sense to be used, then we should go for that label attribute just to provide that service for those people. So that is the option. Let's go into one more element, and that is the optgroup element. And that optgroup element together with the option element that is closing here, those two are the only elements that can be inside the select menu. And in addition to this, they also cannot be, the select menu can also have not any other children inside here. So it's not possible to place a span, a div or anything inside here. It can only have the option and the opt group as its children elements. And the opt group itself, as the name already implies, opt is option group, so we can group our options that are inside the menu according to a certain structure, making it more overseeable for our users in order to make their selections. And in this case, I'm having here two options that are having a URL that are representing a search engine, and the other ones are representing shopping websites. So let me just group those two options inside here. So it serves as a container box for the options that do belong together in a certain group. Now, without us doing anything right now, there won't actually be much difference when we are now taking a look at it. Because, of course, we need to supply a title for each group of options that does exist here. And that, again, is exactly done by using this label attribute. So this one is not specific now to sight disabled people only, but it is for all our users. So here we are indicating the actual title by using this label here, this label attribute. In this case, let me just call this one, for example, search. And now let me call the other ones, for example, shopping. And then let's actually take a look at them on our website. And now we actually have structure inside here, complete structure in here, which makes it much nicer depending on the situation where we would need such a more structured way of presenting it to our user. Let me for a moment go back to our drop-down menu that we had. So once we are removing those attributes on the select menu, what we can also do, we can use our first option here just to represent the indicator, the title basically, of what can be selected inside here. Let me reload the page, and now eBay is being selected by default. Let me just remove that for a moment and let me reload the page. So that is what we can do as well, just to use the first option as a title. So that is what we can do here as well. And now the option itself has this value attribute as mentioned, which we are discussing later on. So that's the select menu in general. Let's now go into the CSS part and let's take a look what control we have in regards to that menu. And it's basically almost complete control apart from the arrow, as we will see in a moment. Let me just randomly apply now a couple of settings so we can actually see it. So the opt group, we can give it a color for a certain group, background, padding, font size, completely up to us ultimately. Same for the individual options, padding, margin, color, etc. It's completely up to us what we specify inside here in order to how we want it to look like. Now the select menu itself, the container box, we do also have control. But the point here is now what we do not have control over is, for example, that arrow here. And also that functionality that is associated, exactly why this arrow is actually there. Because once we are pressing now here, the drop-down menu will appear. Once we are pressing here as well. So that is kind of it lets us control things by pressing this arrow, or that functionality is there, that JavaScript functionality is already being applied on that menu in order to open it and also to navigate through it by using our arrow keys on the keyboard. So that is something that we have seen, that there is an association, a connection actually to the user's operating system. Because all these form control elements do also exist here, by which we, as the name implies, we can control things ultimately. Now, how that connection is in detail, I cannot give you the complete technical reasoning behind here. But what is actually what is going on here is that there is a base look that is going on the operating system. And on top of that base look, the operating system as well uses a certain language in order to apply additional look to those elements. And the same is going on the browsers. Because when we, for example, take a look inside our Chrome browser, such as, for example, our slider again, they look differently. So they also can use a different language other than CSS to apply additional appearance to those elements. However, the point to make is that we do not have control by using CSS on such control features that those elements can have. So what the browsers gave us, what the W20 decided to do already a while ago, but which hasn't further developed this property for quite a while, is the appearance property, which we can set to none. So meaning we are going back to the base look, and the base look, then we have kind of some control. It will give us then some control in CSS of what we can apply. And we have seen it in last week in regards to our checkboxes and radio buttons. Once we have set the appearance to none, we could give them a width and a height, which was not possible before we applied the appearance property with that value none. So what is going on now in regards to our drop-down menu? We are now we are going kind of back to a base look of that element. The functionality is still here, but the actual arrow is not there anymore. It has completely now gone back to that base look, which doesn't include that arrow. So meaning, once we have now not that arrow anymore, we actually do have control of that arrow, because now we can create our own one. By just creating a box, for example, using a div, a span, whatever we want to use ultimately here, and we place that box just on top. And when we place something on top, of course, we take it out of the flow, position, absolute, and we want it to be from here all the way to the right. Meaning from the left 100% ultimately, which makes it to be outside, negative its width, which makes it to be right here. So actually we need to make it relative, or the first thought is to make it relative to the select box, in order so that our left property works, so we can move it from the left 100% and then negative its width to place it, to position it right here. Now the point, however, is our select option, our select element inside there, the only elements that can be inside there are the option and the opt group elements. So therefore we cannot place a div element inside here in order to create our box and make it relative to the select menu. So what we need to do, we just need to create another container box in which our box and the select box is inside, and the select box will have exactly the same width and height. So we do it indirectly basically. Let's take a look at this one. So here we are having our select menu. Nothing can go inside here apart from option and an opt group. and therefore our arrow key cannot go inside here. So what we are now doing, we are just creating another container box, give it a certain width. The select menu we give the same width, so it's basically the same size as this one. And the select, in this case, I've given it a height, so the parent will be as high as its content. So they will have exactly the same size. And then this one is position absolute. This one we make position relative. And because it is relative to here, it's the same size as the select, we can move it to that location, ultimately. So let's go for it, and here is our select container. Let's give it a width of 300 pixels, the container box, make it position relative. The select menu itself, now I've already given a width of 300 or 100% would be the same. And now our actual box for the arrow, we are now creating here a couple of settings. Stylistically, it doesn't matter, but the point here is now we can left refers to the parent, and therefore the same size as the select. 100% from the left, negative its width, and that makes it then to be right at this location. One more thing to consider is that there is a default JavaScript event going on, the reaction event going on when we are clicking the select menu. And that is that the menu will open once we click it. Now we have placed the arrow on top of it, and this element does not have that default event to which to open the menu. So therefore, what we will now be doing, we won't be writing any JavaScript for this one. Instead, we have an option in CSS. There is now our second property that we are introducing, and that is the pointer events. And that is telling the browser, hey, when there is an event going on an element, shall it react to it, or shall it let it through to whoever is behind, whoever element is behind it. And that is exactly achieved by using that value none. So don't react to any pointer events to a click. Instead, let it go through, and behind it is our select menu. So once we click it, now it works again. That is now our second and last property that we are introducing in terms of what it does in functionality wise. And the other value that actually exists here is auto. So automatically react to the click when the element is being clicked, as it was the case before. Actually, there are a couple of further attributes, however, only relevant when we are working with SVG. We have seen it already shortly in this course. SVG is this by which we can draw, etc., and images, drawing images, animating images. It's done by using XML code. So in terms of HTML, the only values is auto and the other one is none. So those values we can use in HTML. So that is our select menu, and that's it now in regards to the form elements whose data will be sent over to the server. And now we are going into form related elements that are either whose data will not be sent over to the server. However, they are or can be connected to form elements, and therefore we are discussing them now. And the first one we are discussing is again a list. However, a list that has not very good browser support at that given stage. So what we are discussing now is just something to keep in the back of our head right now, or at least depending when we are watching this video. But the support is very limited, so it's just really something for the future right now. And that is that we can use an input element of many different types, and we can connect it to a list. So there is one more attribute for the input that we have skipped in last week. So because it is directly related to two further elements. And that first of all is the data list. So again, it's just same as the select here. It's a container box for the individual options that make up the list. In this case, the option element is actually closing, a self-closing element. So the content that each list item, each option represents is determined by the value of the value attribute. So right here. And the reason comes later on, because the value is reserved right here for sending it to the server. The value is always the one in charge. Right here we can see that's the value. The value here, we are sending it to the server later on. But as mentioned, this element has nothing to do with sending stuff to the server, because whatever list item we select in a moment will become the value of the connected input field. So that itself has nothing to do with submission. So something that we get further familiar with later on in the second part. But for now, let's provide that connection. And here with that input element, currently it's of type text. But whichever field we are using, may it be search, may it be URL, it all has the same feature when we are in regards to field-like input elements. And such a connection now, connecting the input to the data list right in here with the options, such a connection we have done in last week already. And it is always done in exactly the same logical way. And that is the element that we are linking to, and we are giving it an identity, value, whatever we want to call it. So let me call it X, Y, whatever it may be. And now for the input element, we are using exactly that value that we have given to that element here. And in this case, in last week, we have made use of the for attribute to link a label to elements. Now we are just using the list attribute. That is really the only difference. The logic behind it is the same. The element we are linking to gets the identity value. The element that we are linking gets that value then. Always the same logical way. And now let's take a look what actually happens when we are linking an input element that is field-like to a list. So here, that list is now being attached to underneath that input element. And that list, inside here, we can navigate. So there is JavaScript behavior already being attached up on the keyboard keys being pressed, go further down the list, etc., or further up. And also what's going on here, there is actually the list already reduces to only those options that are relevant once we are entering something, that are only relevant anymore, that are meeting the term, the term that we have entered. And then once we are doing a selection inside that list, the browser will auto-complete it, and we do not need to, as user, we do not need to enter it completely ourselves. For example, when is that useful? Right now we have made use of it as an input type URL. For example, when we are using it for a search, when we are having a website, and most of the time the same search queries are done by the users. Then we can, for example, create a list with the most searched key terms, the most searched search terms. And so, because then for most people, they do not need to type it out anymore. Instead, they can make that selection from the list. However, this of course does not mean that the people still need to select something from the list. They can still enter whatever they want to. It's just the most likely ones are being there, so that for those who are searching exactly that, for example, they do not need to completely type it out. So that was now in regards to input elements that are field-like. And now we are going into another one who can be connected to a list, and that is the type color. And of course our list must therefore be comprised of colors first of all, so by using the hex code. And Firefox, for example, is not supporting that feature. And let's take a look in Chrome, which is currently supporting it. And here we can see that there is an arrow once again being attached to the color button now. And once we press it, in the pre-selection are those colors that are coming from the list. We can still once again go into other and select our own color. So that is what we would do. The pre-selection is the most likely colors that would be selected, making it easier, quicker for those people to make a selection, for those people who are really looking for those colors that are chosen most of the time, for example. So that is what we can do in terms of color. And what we can also do, however, none of the browsers is yet supporting it, we can connect an input element who has in and decrement functionality. We can connect it to a list. And that was the input types that had to do with date and times. It was our type number, so increment, decrement, meaning they're buttons, so that functionality of incrementing. And it is also our range slider, which has that functionality. So what we can draw here, we can draw the numbers from the list, and these are then the numbers, or that's the intention behind it. These are then the numbers that will be incremented, that are coming from that list, or will be used on the slider for where the knob of the slider can be and what number it represents. However, as mentioned, none of the browsers are yet supporting it, so it doesn't make sense to even take a look at it. And in general, it's really something for the future. The HTML is really not supported as much. There is buggy behavior going on as well. And it is not just the HTML part. Let us now go into the CSS part. Actually, let's give the container box, let's give it a padding at the top and at the bottom, and let's give the individual options a little bit of stylistic random settings, greater font size, background padding, letter spacing, whatever it may be, and we will see none of that will get applied. The list will still look like the same as it did before. So it's still something really, as mentioned, something to keep just in the back of our head for the future. Let's go into the next one, and that is the output elements, and that is a meaningful element to represent a number that comes from several number fields, input type number or range. Based upon the numbers that the user is inserting, we will then do a calculation with those ones. So whatever that may be, dividing things up, multiplying, whatever we want. So that is the output then. It's just then the number that goes inside the output element. So it's just a meaningful element based to represent the result of a calculation, or to represent the result of a user action that has to do with numbers. For example, when we are changing the slider in order to indicate to the user where this slider knob is at this given point and what number it represents. So that is just really a meaningful element, this output element, and the actual value that then how that value gets inside here, the result of the calculation or the output of the slider, that we need JavaScript for. So for now, all we need to know at this given stage, it's a meaningful element to represent an output, and then the rest is JavaScript. And it works together by using the name attribute. We can use it. That is the, besides the meaning that it has, it also has this name attribute that allows us to write more efficient JavaScript. It makes us easier, it facilitates us in writing less JavaScript and more efficient JavaScript, that name attribute. And that name attribute is usually used to send the data over to the server for those elements whose data will be sent. But the output, again, his data will not be sent. So the name attribute is just used here for really JavaScript reasons. And so is the form attribute. So we can, the output, when the output is representing other input elements and it is located outside a form, we can still link it to a form ultimately. But it has nothing to do with the submission. We would just link it to the form to provide more meaning, more sense of our content for the other softwares who are reading our HTML code. So that is what the form and the name is used here for. It has nothing to do with the submission. And what also is there, again, the for attribute, again, to provide further meaning, more logic for the other softwares, such as also for screen readers, for example. So we can link it now, and it's done in exactly the same way. So for example, let me give this one an identity dub. Let me give this one an identity q. And now we can use the for attribute same way as we did it in last week with our label elements that we have linked to the elements to which the label is, who the label is representing for. And now the for attribute. So it's for, that is the output for the elements q, white space, we can divide it up, and then comes the second value. So that's all we want to discuss for now in regards to the output. The name and the form together, they are used together to provide us more efficient than functionality in terms of JavaScript. Something we go over later on. Let's go into the next one, and this is the meter, and now we are dealing with a bar that is representing a scale value. So this bar can be filled with a certain color, either in red, in green, or in some sort of yellow, and depending on the browser, either to indicate a positive, a negative, or a medium value. And the bar, of course, can also be filled to a certain extent, so that is completely by how we define it by using these attributes right here. Again, there is the form attribute, has nothing to do with the submission, but we can, for example, link it to a form, because the meter on its own, its data will not be sent. But, for example, it can represent an input field. Whatever we insert inside number fields, we can then visually indicate to the user by using such a bar how his result was, for example, whatever he inserted, how his body fat is, whatever our form fields are about, just to indicate that visually by using such a scale bar. And such a bar, so therefore can be linked to a form when it's being used for form elements. But no other submission purpose. It cannot be submitted, same as the other ones are under this category right here. Let's go now into the attributes that determine by how much the color shall be inserted inside that bar. To what extent the color shall appear inside here. And there are 3 values that are in charge here that we need to define in order for the browser to know to what extent to include a color inside that bar. And that first of all is the value itself. So when we are dealing, for example, I don't know, when we are dealing with degrees makes maybe, or when we are dealing with the weather, for example, to indicate how much degrees the weather is at a point, some sort of economic indicator, some sort of test results. So for example, let's go for that test result. 25 is our value, for example, points we did on a test. And then what we need to do, of course, we still need to tell the browser, hey, what's the maximum? In order for the browser to know, how much is this? Of what? How much of the maximum? 100 points, for example. But still, sometimes in regards to a test score, points make sense. It starts at 0. There is no negative number. But in terms of degrees, when we think of the weather in degrees, it can go negative as well. So therefore, in some situations, we also need to define the minimum, which can be a negative value. And in this case, it would then not be 1/4 the browser we want him to fill the bar. It would be less, because our range is now 120, and 25 of 120 is less than 1/4. So once we really give it 0, then it is 1/4. We achieve 25 points, for example, of a possible 100 points that we have here. And now the browser knows, okay, now 1/4 of that bar I need to fill with a color. And now the next 3 attributes, they now determine which color the browser shall use. Whether that value that we achieved here, those points, whether that is a good, a medium, or a bad value. And that is achieved now by using the low, what we do consider ourselves as low value. For example, everything below 30 points is bad, so it will most likely now be red. And what is considered to be high, so that is, for example, everything above 80 points on the test is considered to be a high value. At this given stage, however, the browser does not yet know, now is a low value considered to be a good value, or is it the high value considered to be a good value? Let's, for example, assume that our value is 25 mistakes we did on the test. And the maximum of mistakes that can be done is 100. So therefore, we need to tell the browser, hey, what's the optimum? Is 0 good, or is 100 good? Is that low, or is that high? So that is determined by now our last attribute, and that is the optimum. Let's go, for example, for 100, meaning we are dealing with points. Maximum is 100 points. That's the maximum. 25 is below the low value. Therefore, the browser now knows to make that filled bar, to make it red inside there. And when we are in between, let's go for 35, which is in between the low and the high. Now the browser knows to make it yellow. And once we are now going, for example, above 80, or once we are turning it around and say the optimum is 0, so we are dealing with mistakes, and go back to 25, then we are below the low, but the low is considered to be good, and therefore it will be green. So that is the control that we do have here. However, the control is not provided in the Microsoft browsers. And that is in regards to Internet Explorer 11 and also in regards to iOS Safari. So there, for those browsers, most likely as remedy solution, we would just not visually indicate it, nothing else. For example, we would then, I've written a little bit of JavaScript here, we would just then kind of differently represent it, but just not using the meter. Or, for example, we would create it ourselves, such a meter, which would also be an idea, because the control that we have in terms of CSS, how that meter looks like, is also kind of limited. And let's take a look at this one. So in terms of the meter, right here, let us give it, first of all, let's give it a width, a height, a border, and a background. So what effect that now has. So everything got applied inside the Firefox browser. Let's take a look inside the Chrome browser, for example. The width and the height got applied. The background and the border, however, they did not. So here already are some cross-browser differences, first of all, in terms of what we can control by using CSS. Now, as soon as we give it a padding, that will actually destroy the entire inner part of that container box in which the filled color part is inside. So in each and every browser it will now be destroyed. Now the Chrome browser actually now took the background color, but the inner part is completely gone. So we cannot really apply a padding if we want that color to remain there. And again, also we cannot really control the color inside there because it is a sub part of the actual element. So that's the container, and we want to select the inner part. And selecting the inner part is currently not possible because there are no valid selectors, no standard selectors out there. So what we need to do actually, we need to select the inner part when it's a good value, when it's a bad and a medium in order to style it. So what the WebKit, for example, has the in-house selectors. However, they are not standard. They shouldn't be used. It's not recommended at least. And because they will change most likely in the future. Let's go into the next one, and that is the progress. Again, of course, under this category, it's an element whose data will not be sent over to the server. And the progress bar is being used, as the name implies, to indicate a progress. For example, we can use it for a video. Underneath the video, there's always the bar, how much the video has been played, which bar can also be pressed to jump to a different location on the video. So that would be an example where we could use the progress bar to indicate the progress of a video. Now, this has nothing to do with any form. However, we can use it in conjunction with forms. For example, when we are using it for an upload, to indicate visually the progress of an upload, and the upload always has to do with forms. So it can be used in conjunction with forms, and therefore we are discussing it right now. And of course, it will always start at 0. So that's the beginning, and then it goes to wherever it will go to. For example, in terms of a file that's being uploaded, that will be in kilobytes, or for example, the video will be in seconds, how many seconds a video has played, or where the end is. So we do not really have a minimum here, as we did with the meter. Only a maximum, because the minimum is always 0. An actual value and a maximum. Value and max. These are the only ones that are used for the progress element. And that, of course, is being used, it is used in conjunction with JavaScript. Because this value that goes inside here, let me just use it, for example, to indicate 25,000 kilobytes have been uploaded, for example, of a maximum of 30,000, for example. So it has progressed quite far. That is how much now it is indicated here in terms of color. Now this value, of course, here, the value for the value attribute. This one, of course, starts at 0, and it will change continuously. It will change from 0 going towards 30,000, towards the end. And that is what we do with JavaScript. Then later on, change that value, select the progress bar, and change the value depending on how much the file has been uploaded. So that is the progress. One more comment in regards to CSS, first of all, because the progress can be in an indeterminate state, so where it is not certain how much of the bar needs to be filled with a color. So that is sometimes the case for a very short period of time when the browser is just calculating how great the file size is, or how long the video is, for example. So therefore, this element can therefore also be in the indeterminate state, for which there is a pseudo class selector, as we have seen it in last week, for the submit buttons, the checkboxes and radio buttons. So this pseudo selector therefore also reacts to the progress when this one is in an indeterminate state, and we can give it a certain look based upon that state. However, the look, again, there is limited control that we actually have. So in terms of, first of all, width and height is completely fine. We can apply it. However, basically anything else, now I've just used 0, I think. Let me just change this one again back to 25,000, for example, so we can actually see it. So the width and height is fine across the browsers. But as soon as we now give anything else, padding, border, background, whatever it may be, the default look that the browser uses here will be destroyed, and this is how it ends up. Same inside the Chrome browser. So this is how it ends up ultimately. So it's limited in how we can control it, And the next reason is again because we need to control the sub part here, the inner part, to which there is no selector. So there are again a couple of selectors that we have, those ones, however, at this given point are not standard, and they are not they don't seem to be on a standard track, even though for those ones actually I think should be going in that direction, since across the browsers it's quite okay, kind of. But still it's vague, so it's not standard. Definitely nothing that the W3C at this point determines it to be a standard. So let's see what control we have in the future, what the W3C, what they decide for us, what control they will ultimately give us for those ones. Let's go into the last part now, and that is two structural elements again. And those ones we would use when our form is divided up into individual parts, as it is the case right here, for example, and each part is being represented by a title. And that would be, for example, the case when we are dealing with the shipping address, the invoice address. So that is how forms, of course, can be divided up into individual parts. And those individual parts, they are two meaningful elements that represent those individual parts, which we should make use of just for the sake, as usual, to have more meaning for the other softwares that are reading our code. And the field set is the actual container box for an individual part. And then there is the legend element, which must always then be the first child inside the field set, and it can only be inside here. And this one is the title, the legend, as the name implies, then for the certain area of the form, the certain section of the form, to represent in a textual form what this form part is about. Now, there is a default appearance going on in terms of that there is a border being there by default on the field set, and the title itself also has some default appearance, even though that's not it. I did that myself. But the point here is we should make use of it because of the meaning. The actual default look we can always remove. So that is not a problem. So that is, for example, that's how it looks like once we have removed it completely. Then, but the point is the meaning. That's the actual reason why we would use these elements, not for the appearance, as usual, as always. And these two, the field set, now in addition to having meaning, there is actually also further control that it gives us over the entire elements, form elements that are inside that field set, that belong to that section. Because that element here has also, for example, the disabled attribute, meaning we can therefore disable the entire form elements that are inside a field set. And also there is the name attribute by which we can, which allows us to write more efficient JavaScript once again. So that is, in addition to having meaning, it also has these features. Now that JavaScript part, of course, that is not our topic, but let me briefly go into an example. So inside the legend there is a checkbox now, input type checkbox. And now when this checkbox changes, it works together with the form element again, and now with the name of the field set. Then that field set with that name, it shall be disabled when it is not being checked, that checkbox. So that would be an example, and it makes it much more efficient to write that JavaScript by using that name attribute. Now the user has control whether he wants those settings to apply or not by just checking or unchecking it, for example. So that is something that the field set gives us as well. And then again, there is the form attribute. Field set, again, it's data. It will not be sent to the server, but it can be linked to a form when the field set is located outside the form. And it is just, again, a visual connection that can be made here. It is something just to have more meaning again, same as it was the case previously for the other elements. The meter, for example, the form, it can be linked to a form, same as the output. And the form itself we are now going into. So now comes our second part of this week. We are now going into the actual process of submitting the data to the server. At least we will, of course, be concentrating on the HTML part that is relevant to us, to that topic of submitting the data. The PHP we will not take a look at. That is a language we will take a look, of course, then later on. So the form element, first of all, we have made use of it in last week already. Just very briefly, the form, of course, as the name implies, the form is the form. So in terms of our sheet, the sheet is the form itself, of course. So it is a container box, and we have used it in last week exactly for that purpose. So we have, for example, included all our input elements inside a form element. So the form element, let me just scroll down to the input elements. The form is starting right here. Then come all the different input types that we have discussed here. And the form we have ended right here. So inside the form are all these input elements, including the submit and the reset button. Let me just for a moment scroll down here just to indicate it once again. So the form is closing here, and the submit and the reset buttons are inside here as well. And because these submit and reset buttons are inside a form, once we are now pressing them, as we have seen it in last week, once we press them, they actually have their functionality now, because now the browser knows what to reset. It now knows, I reset button belongs to that form, so I need to reset whatever else belongs to that form. And same with the submit button. So now I submit button belongs to that form, so now I know what I need to submit, and that is whatever else, whatever data belongs to that form as well. And therefore our page at least is already at least reloading. So the functionality is already kicking in, because now it knows who it belongs to. It must submit and reset whatever is inside the form, who it also belongs to. So everything must belong to a form, and by default whatever is inside a form will automatically belong to that form. However, that does not necessarily need to be the case. For example, let's assume we had another field or whatever further down the page, then we could just not end that form element further down. So we can still, however, link now that input field or whatever it may be, we can link it to the form so that it still belongs to that form, and then its data will also be submitted to the server, even though it is not inside the form located inside the form element. So let's take a look at this one, that connection, because we have done it quite a number of times now already. Let's give our form element, the element that we are linking to, let's give it an identity, for example, QWE, whatever it may be. And now let's go up to our two elements whose data can also be sent to the server. And that is our text area, and it is our select element. And now let's link them to the form by using the form attribute here and exactly the value that we have used for the identity. So meaning now our text area, even though they are located outside the form, they do now nevertheless, they do now belong to the form. So that is what we can do. However, it is not supported inside the Microsoft browsers. So the solution that exists here, we can write a little bit of JavaScript in order to still link those elements to the form, then even in the Microsoft browsers, but that is by default at least, it's not supported right now. We still need to write a little bit of JavaScript then here if we have use of such a situation. So that is what we can do, and that is what always the input element is doing, or what always these elements are having under the submission, the form. So it's under the submission because now once it's linked the input to a form, its data will be sent. Otherwise it will not. And that is the first step now. Everything must belong to a form in order for its data to be sent to the server. And now we are going into the next step, what we need to do in order for the data to be sent. And therefore, let us first of all visually once again take a look what is actually going on. So here we are dealing with a form element. Once again, as we saw it again in last week, we fill the data, the fields out, and then we hit the button, and what will happen? The data will be sent over to the server. On the server there is a language such as PHP. We will be writing code in that language in order to grab that data, and then we can pass it on. We will be writing code in MySQL as well in order to store that data inside a database. And then once we have successfully logged in and registered, a message may appear, some sort of content, welcome to the page, whatever it may be. So some sort of HTML code is coming back, that message, which is HTML code, and the browser will display whatever is coming back from the server. So in this situation, what we have just done, we just send over data to the server, we posted data over in order to store it there, basically posted it on the server. However, that does not always need to be the case. For example, here we are dealing with a search form element, a form element that has the purpose of doing a search here. So it consists of an input field, a select menu that we have seen now, and it consists of a button. So let's do a search. Let's search for all TV episodes, for example, that have DE inside their name. Once we hit the button, wheel starts to turn, and what has happened now, again, we went to the server, we sent over TV episodes and our search term DE. On the server, PHP grabs that data and then asks the database, hey, give me all the rows inside the database that are TV episodes and that contain DE inside their name. And that is what the database does. And then PHP uses an HTML file on the server, which of course we will be writing later on, an HTML file with a lot of boxes that provide the structure already, and then PHP will fill these boxes with the data that was coming back from the database. And then that is the HTML file that is then sent to the browser can parse it and then can display it. Here we can see the boxes that make up the structure, and then those boxes are filled with the content that came back from the database. So here we are dealing with a situation where we are posting data to the server in order to get new data. We are not posting data to post it there, to store it there, but in order to get it. And these are exactly the two situations when we are dealing with the server. And that is something to keep in mind in order to follow now, to have the logic behind what we are discussing in a moment. One more comment I want to make, however, because it is not always the case that we are dealing with a button that we are pressing and then the wheel starts to turn and a page is reloading. So that not necessarily does need to happen. For example, once we are checking a box here, now all the BMWs are being listed of the series 6. What just happened once we checked this box, we went to the server of the BMW website, and on that server it said to the database, hey, give me all the BMWs of the 6 series. Those ones came back and then are listed right here. So in exactly the same way, but there was no button first of all, and there was also no page load. So there does not need to be a page load, so just to consider that, so it's still going to the server nonetheless. But the two situations where we are going is either to get data or to post data there, to store it there. Let's go into the form element, and therefore what we need to do, we need to define a path to the server where we want to send the data to. And that is defined by using the action attribute. So our first attribute that we are now using for our form element right here. There is actually the name, it only has JavaScript functionality, again same as the other ones that have nothing to do with submission. And the form itself, it will not be submitted as well, it's the content, everything that belongs to the form will be submitted. So let's provide an action, so a path to the server, and of course we must send the data to a file that is of PHP. However, what we need to consider, and that is basically just something for later on when we are getting started with PHP, but to have the logic now in case we, for example, already want to start working with it. So what we need, of course, we need to create PHP files, but in NetBeans, what we need to do, we need to tell NetBeans, hey, we want PHP functionality. And therefore we need to load our project in as a PHP project. So as a new project, instead of going for HTML5 JavaScript with existing sources, which is our folder always, we are just going for PHP with existing sources with our folder. And once we have done so, it's indicated by us by this icon here that we are now having a PHP project. And now, same as we create HTML files, we can now also create PHP files. And that is what I have already done. I have created a PHP file. And that file I have located on the server in the same directory as our homepage. So there is nowhere we need to go. All we need to do in this case, just need to use the name of the file plus its extension. And now we have defined the path to the server, which is now our second step. So we need to tell a path to the server, to a PHP file, and everything must belong to a form. And now comes the third step. Because at this given stage, nothing has yet worked. Once we are filling out, for example, let's fill something out here. Now let's hit the submit button. And what will happen? we are already contacting the server, exactly that file form.php. However, inside that form.php file, what I'm actually doing here, by using that bit of PHP code, which doesn't matter for now, I'm grabbing the data that is coming in, I'm formatting it, and then I'm just sending it back to the browser. So the browser is receiving the exact same data that he actually sent, just in a formatted way. And when we are looking here, the data actually did not come through. And that is because now we need to there is also one more thing that we need to follow in order for the data to be sent in the first place. And that is, let's for example assume that the data would have been sent for a moment. Here we can see up here, if that data would have been sent, this text would have been sent to the server. Then on the server we would have no clue. Now, is this the username? Is this the first name, the last name? Is this the street name? Whatever. We had no clue what value, what text actually belongs to what. So therefore, we need always, the value must not always be the only thing to be sent over to the server, the text in this case here. It must always consist of a second part as well, which is the indicator what this text is about, which form element it belongs to. And that is created by using the name attribute. And that name attribute must be given to all form elements whose data can and shall be sent over to the server, which is textarea, which is our select option, which are all our input types, and which can also be given to the button, which we are taking a look at in a moment. But the name, we must provide that association. The data is always comprised of two things: the name and the actual value. The text, for example, that was inserted inside that field, or the color that was selected. The file that was selected is the value. The name is the association, which file button that file actually belongs to, which color button, which field that text or color belongs to. So let me just hand out now a couple of names for the fields that we are now making a couple of examples with. The value that we want to use here is completely up to us. So in this case, for example, let me call it uname, username, and let me now use that name also for two more here, for the disabled and read-only, so we can see the differences now in action here between those two. Let me call it read for a moment. Doesn't matter what we want to call it. And that one disabled. Let me just call it disabled. So we know on the server what belongs to what. And now let me also go into our file for a moment, because here we are doing an example with as well. Let me just call it file. We can call it differently. And let me also use our two elements that are being located outside the form, so that we have now an example in action that the text area and the select menu still belong to the form, since we have linked it to it by using the form attribute. So therefore also let me just call it txt for text, whatever it may be. And now the name also for the select menu, so that the selected options are being sent over to the server. Let me just call it select for a moment. Doesn't matter. Whatever it is about. Now let's insert something. So here it is already, something is already in there. Let's make a selection right in here, whatever it may be. Let's also insert something into here, which we have given a name. This one we did not give a name. This one will not be sent. Therefore, doesn't matter whether we insert something here. Now the telephone number is read-only. This one will be sent as we will see in a moment. The date and times is disabled. This one will not be sent. And now let's also select a file. This one we have given a name to, so this one will be sent kind of as well. Let's take a look. So here we can see now the data got sent, because now we know on the server what belongs to what. This is the name, this is the value. This is the value that belongs to this name, this is the association. So the data always comes in pairs. It's considered to be the name and the value pair, or the key and the value pair. So that's the name, that's the value for our selected option that we have selected. That's the name for the username, etc. Read-only came through the name. We did not fill anything out because we couldn't, it was read-only. But its data is still be sent. Its data refers to the name and the value. The value is now considered an empty value. So it's still a value that is still there. It's just considered to be empty. and the disabled was not sent. So now we have a live action example here. What is meant by sending, whether it is possible or not. For disabled, data will not be sent. For read-only, it will be sent. Now for the file, it did also go through. However, we will see in a moment, the file actually itself did not go through. And that is now what we are taking a look at by using our next attribute here, which is the method. Because here we are telling the browser how we want the data to be sent to the server. There are two different options that we have. And that is either the value get or the value post. Two values that we just have heard when we have gone over the visual example, what is going on when we are sending data. So it's get and it is post. And as a rule of thumb, when we are getting new data from the server, we are using get, and when we are posting data to the server to store it there, we are using post. As a rule of thumb. But now comes the logic, and sometimes in a few situations that rule of thumb will not be the case, but we will get it then by what we are discussing right now. So what the method default value is get. And what this one is doing is it will attach the entire data that is being sent, it will attach it to the URL. And we can see it here, it's completely attached to the URL, and there are certain characters being used in here that are the indicators to the machine, basically what belongs to what. So the question mark, for example, sometimes it's also the hash pound symbol that is used, that is the indicator, hey, now something is attached to the URL. And then comes the actual attachment. So that's the name, equal sign, divided up by equal sign, then the value. And then comes the end symbol, and then comes again the name and the value. Name, value, name, value, name, value. It's all being attached to the URL. Now when would that be useful? And that is, the value is get here. When we are using get, we are getting data from the server, which is most often the case when we are doing something with a search. And in this case, right here, we have searched already for the BMW series, the 6er series. Now this URL is therefore, we can share it on a social platform, and the people who are then visiting this website are visiting it in the way that already the BMW series, the 6er series, is already been there, the search. So we can present that website in exactly the same way as we have done those settings already right here, whatever settings we have applied, when it is being attached to the URL. So that's the advantage. Therefore, we can also bookmark it. And what we can also do as a web developer, when a person has visited such a search website and has done some settings here, has changed, for example, his to how much amount of money he wants the BMWs to be listed, etc. So all these settings can be stored by web developers in order so when the user is coming back later, he will then be represented with exactly the same page with already filled out the form here, the settings, as it was when he just left the website maybe 2 days ago. So these are the advantages of when we are attaching things via the URL. It's also considered to be a little bit faster. Now let's take a look at the disadvantages. The URL has a limited amount of characters that can be entered in here. And usually when we are having a little bit larger data, we definitely don't send it via the URL. And also we would not send it via the URL when none of those advantages are being met, when we don't want to revisit it, share it, or bookmark it, for example. So therefore, that is usually the case when we are posting data to the server in order to store the data there. So when we are going for that post value. And what post is doing, we are only discussing, very touching the overview here. Because what is actually going on, it will be attached to the so-called body of the message that's being sent. When we are sending things to the server, there is also always a header part and a body part. The header part is indicating what it is about, basically, and the inner part is the content itself, the body part. So that is similar as in HTML, basically, with using our head and body element. But this is completely about data communication. So, but what it does, let me reload the page first. So what it does, it will just attach it to the body part of the message and not the URL anymore. So that's enough information for now, at least. When we are getting into PHP, we will take a closer look at this one actually, how data is being sent. But now it's not being attached to the URL anymore, and that is what we usually would do when we are posting data. So where we do not have the advantages of get, where we don't need them, and where we have larger data that the URL may or may not can fit inside it. Now the default value, as mentioned, is get, and that influences also the default value now for our next one, and that is the enc type, encoding type that is being used. Because it is by default get, therefore by default it is being attached to the URL. And we have seen there are some certain characters. There. Did I save it? No. There are some certain characters that cannot be used inside the URL. Because they are already being used, meaning those ones cannot be sent. They are already the indicator, the delimiters to the machine, what belongs to what. And otherwise, if those ones were sent in form of data, then the browser would get confused. Then it would not know anymore what belongs to what. And also there are not only reserved characters, such as those ones, there are also some characters that would destroy the functionality of a URL. For example, a white space. There cannot be any white space inside the URL. So what the browser needs to do when data is being sent via the URL that consists of such characters, it needs to replace these characters, encode them. Such as, for example, our white space is being used here using the plus symbol. Then the // is used in the URL. It's a delimiter used to divide up the segments here, the folders in our case, as we have seen it. And therefore it needs to replace those ones, otherwise it would mess the URL up. So therefore there must be a certain encoding going on, which we need to tell the browser, hey, encode it in a certain way so that it can be sent via the URL. And that is a format again. So it's a MIME type that is being registered at the IANA. And whenever something gets registered, it gets registered, as we know, under a certain main category, and then it receives a unique identifier, together the so-called MIME type. And this one in this case is x and then form URL encoded. So that is exactly, we can already get it from what we are reading here. URL encoded and form URL encoded. This is exactly what's going on. Replace the characters that cannot be used inside the URL. And that is what's going on by default. That's the value being used by default, because the default value is get, and things are being sent by default via the URL. However, once we are changing that value to post, so when we are not getting any data, when we are sending the data in the body of the message, then this encoding does not need to go on because we are not sending it via the URL. So those characters do not need to be replaced. When we are sending random data from fields, for example, such as, for example, a login or registration where there are only a couple of fields for password, for email, etc., people tend to not replace it, because then the browser, okay, then it does a little bit of inefficient work here. It replaces some certain characters, even though it does not need to do it because we are sending it in the body and not inside the URL. But it is not harmful, because there is only a little bit of inefficiency taking him a couple of milliseconds to actually do that encoding. However, once we are using a file, then this will change completely. Let's, for example, assume that we are uploading an image. An image consists of many, many pixels. Let's, for example, assume 30,000. Each pixel consists of the hex value, which represents a color. So each pixel 30,000 times, this here must be encoded. So first of all, once we are uploading files, this one must be changed so that this inefficiency of encoding such characters will not go on. And in addition to this, there is also a different encoding going on when we are dealing with files. So this encoding type it divides things up in multiple parts. It is therefore also registered under this one multi-part, and now the actual multi-part and the actual is form data. So that is what we need to change it to whenever we are dealing with files. Otherwise, it's compulsory to reduce the inefficiency maybe, but once we are dealing with files, it's a must. Otherwise, the file cannot be uploaded to the server. Now here we can see the file. Our selected file, the name of it actually already got sent. However, the actual file itself did not get sent to the server, due to the fact that we had not yet changed this value here for the enc type encoding type attribute to multipart form data to that MIME type. So therefore, let us now test it once again. And the file is still being attached here. And here we can see now the file, there is much more information to it that is now being sent, and the file itself has also now been sent to the server, which wasn't the case before. One more attribute in regards to the form, that is in regards to kind of characters, and that is the accept char set. So what this one is doing is the character set. And that is something that we do already know from further up here. Meta, char set, character set. And that is telling the browser how the ones and zeros, or how the characters should be interpreted to their format that they have as ones and zeros when they are being sent. So, or when they are being received, the ones and zeros, how they shall be interpreted. So what the browser can do, it can use different tables, different code tables. We have seen it, the ASCII code. It only includes the Latin, so-called Latin alphabetical characters A through Z. And if we are telling the browser, hey, don't use UTF-8, then by default it is using the US ASCII code, which only consists of A through Z. And when we are then making use of such characters as those ones, or Chinese, Russian characters, and those ones are coming in at the browser as ones and zeros, then the browser will use the ASCII table to map those ones and zeros, but those characters are not inside that table, and therefore they cannot be represented as such. So what we need to do if we want to make use of such characters, we need to turn it to tell the browser, hey, make use of the universal table that has the formats, the ones and zero formats of all the characters inside, meaning the ones and zeros can always be accurately be matched to the according symbol that those ones and zeros do actually represent. And when we do not define anything right down here for exactly that attribute, then the value that's being used here is unknown, and that tells the browser, hey, use exactly what we defined up there inside the meta element. And here we can, for example, go for US ASCII and we can tell the browser, hey, when other characters apart from A through Z are being entered inside here, when they are being sent to the server as ones and zeros, they should, only those ones that are inside the ASCII should be mapped to ones and zeros. The other ones will not be sent as such due to the fact that we provide such a restriction here. That is most likely, of course, something that we would not do, but it at least gives us that control if we want to only send certain characters to the server and do not want to allow all the characters to be sent as their actual characters to the server. So unknown is the default, which just takes whatever is defined up inside the meta. Usually it's UTF-8, so Universal Transformation Format, which has any characters inside it. Two more attributes now, and those ones, one of them we already know, and that is the target. We have seen it in conjunction with our iframe. There are three values that do only refer to iframes, so those ones we are not going over now. But two values which are commonly used, which are self and blank. So we determine here whatever is coming back from the server. Shall it be opened inside the same tab, or shall it be opened inside a different tab? So self is inside the same tab, and the other one is blank inside a different tab. Now the next one is no validate, and we have seen inside the form there is default validation first going on. For example, the email, the URL and number, they are validated by default, and we can also apply some validation and tell the browser what needs to be entered inside a certain field or what needs to be selected, etc., as we know. And here, by using exactly that no validate, we can turn it off. So hey browser, when the form is being submitted, do not validate anything. Just let it send through. We want to do the check on the server only, and maybe for the reason because we want to use our own messages right here, which we then can attach to underneath here. So that would be a reason why we would want to go for no validate. And it's a Boolean attribute, does not need a value, either we specify it or we do not. Now, that is all. These are all the attributes that the form element has in regards to submission. Let's now take a look at the input, our buttons that are in charge of submitting the form. And that is, first of all, either the input type submit or image, or the other one is our button type submit, which we should use for the mentioned reason in last week, and which we will also be touching on in a moment once again. but those ones, our submit types, they can also receive exactly those attributes as we have just discussed them. The only thing, because we can apply them on those elements and we are not inside the form elements, so what we are doing, attach, pre-attach form before it, form and then action, form method, form type. The reason why this one exists is so that we do still have the possibility to work with multiple buttons, multiple submit buttons. And if we want to do different actions based upon one button being pressed in comparison to the other button being pressed, then we can provide that different action by defining exactly those settings here. So that is the reason for it. All we need to do is provide form and then method, form and then action, and so on. But otherwise, it is exactly, in terms of what it does, exactly the same. Let's do 2 more attributes and then we are done. And those attributes, again, of course, directly have to do with the submission. And those ones can be applied to all the elements that can be submitted to the server. That is our button, our input, our text area, and our select. These are the only 4. And those ones must have a name, as we have seen. So that is the precondition. Everything must have a name in order for us to know on the server what belongs to what inserted text belongs to which form element, is it the username, street address, etc. So the name is a must. And now there are a couple of situations where the name attribute is still used for the same reason, but where we need to discuss a couple of things. And that, for example, is in regards to our radio buttons. And in general, always when something belongs together, they will share the same name. Same with multiple checkboxes. Same with if we are using multiple file upload buttons for the same purpose, to create a sprite ultimately from all these different uploaded files, for example. Then they will share the same name. And in terms of the radio buttons, that is even providing them the functionality, how radio buttons are, the purpose of them. They always come in multiple, and only one of them belonging to the same question, 5 of them, only one of them can be checked. Selecting another one will deselect the previous one. So they all belong to the same question, and in order for the browser to know that, hey, in our case, these 3 do belong to the same question, we need to hand out the same name in order for only one of them to be able to be checked. So let's give those radio buttons now exactly the same name. For example, let's just call it Q1, for example. And now let me copy and paste it over. And as soon as we have done so and now reloaded the page, only one of them can now be checked. The purpose of why radio buttons exist has now been accomplished. And now, as mentioned, this is not only the case in radio buttons, but whenever something belongs together. For example, here we are dealing with these many checkboxes, all belong to the same question, which series of BMWs we want to have listed. They all share the same name. So let's give them exactly the same name. And in that case, let's give it the name series, exactly what we are doing the example on right now. Let's use exactly the same thing. What we need to pay attention to here now is, however, because checkboxes, not only one of them can be checked. Meaning, when we are now checking multiple, then of course we want multiple, one name, all these ones, they share the same name, and this one single name must hold multiple values. And by default, the browser, by default, only is able, one name can hold one value. So let's just visually for a moment take a look at this one. So let's now submit it, and we can see only one got sent through actually. For that name series, only one value is there. And that is, whenever we want one name to hold multiple values, we need to tell the browser, hey, please use a container box, which allows you, browser, to send multiple values for the same name. And such a container box is called an array, which we are working with when we are getting in programming quite often. And that is done. We are telling the browser, hey, use a container box, such an array, when we are attaching these square brackets afterwards. Let me reload the page, let me check 2 of them, let's submit it, and we can see the series has now been turned into this container, this array, in which again there are now 2 values comprised of a name and a value again. numerically being indexed here, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Nothing that we need to worry at this stage, but in terms of HTML, that is what we need to pay attention to, attaching these square brackets. So that is the case, for example, when dealing with multiple checkboxes that belong together. It would also be the case, for a moment, let me select multiple files, which we have allowed by specifying the multiple attribute. Now let's hit send, and now we can see only the letter one we have selected was actually being sent to the server. That is because, again, once we are sending multiple values to the server, which is also the case for when we define multiple here, we need to tell the browser use this container box, and once we have done so by attaching these square brackets, and once we are now selecting multiple files, the browser is now able to send these multiple files because it is now using such a container box. So that is what we need to pay attention to in terms of this name attribute as well. So it is always whatever belongs together shares the same name, and when there is multiple values being sent for the same name, they must be turned into a container box. The last comment on the name is in terms of the button. Now the button itself doesn't seem like that its data should be sent over to the server, but again, when we are dealing with multiple submit buttons, for example, or that is actually the scenario when it is being used, then we want to know which button was actually being pressed. And by using the name, we can, first of all, then the information is being sent over from the buttons in the first place. As we know, whenever it needs a name in order for information in order for data to be sent. So let's therefore give both of them, they share the same name, both submit buttons belong to the same form, the same question purpose, and let's just call them therefore btn for button, for example. And now let's give both of them a button value, and now once we are submitting, we will see that the button is now also being sent over. And by default, what's being sent over is whatever is written inside the button. And that is whatever is written inside here is because by default, that is exactly what's being used for the value attribute if we don't define anything else. And that is browser dependent, what they write onto the button. But the point is, that is exactly what is the value. And that is now where we are going into the last attribute. Because we know everything comes in name value pairs. Name value, name value. Now by default this is used. And if we are using submit buttons by creating them using the input element, then of course often it is the case, usually it is the case that we want to use our own text on top of here. But that text may not be the same text that we want to have sent over to the server in order to differentiate which button was being pressed. So that's the reason why this value attribute we cannot use. It's already reserved. We cannot use it for two different purposes: to define the name on the button, inside the button, and to define what's being sent over to the server. That is again the third advantage, if we can remember from what we have discussed in last week, which the button element has. It has more meaning, it has further control in terms of how we want it to look like, because it is a closing element. And thirdly, now we also have control. We can give it a different value what we want to have sent over to the server. For example, btn1, and the other one, for example, we want to call btn2, and it will not conflict with the actual content that's being written inside the button. So the button element is the recommended way of creating buttons. But that is now the value attribute. And now let's take a look at the value attribute in regards to our other elements. Because we have seen it in last week, we can use the value attribute to determine a pre-value. For example, for a field-like element, we can use the value attribute. Let me just use it for the search, for example. So we can, or let me use it for our first one, the username. And we can use it to pre-enter something inside here, whatever we want. And as soon as the page is loaded, then that whatever we have defined by that value has already been entered right in here. However, whenever we now modify it, and when the data is then being sent, the value will change whatever is inside here. So we can use it to predefine a value, but when that one is changed, it will also change when the data is being sent. Because that is, again, it's what it's being sent over to the server. It just has that possibility of giving us the opportunity to already define a pre-value, but it will change. Same, for example, let's go down to the color button for a moment. So here we can define a pre-value. For example, we want the color white to be the one that is pre-selected in form of its hex code. And once we have done so and reloaded the page, the color white will be selected. It's the value attribute. Once the user is changing it, then the color orange becomes the value when the data is being sent over to the server. Since the value is always the value that's being sent over, the name and the value, name, value, always these two pairs. Now in terms of sending now, let's go into a couple of things what we need to pay attention to here, and that is in particular referring to radio buttons and checkboxes. Because it will now give us the logic why we are not using the value attribute here in order to pre-check a checkbox or a radio button from the beginning when the page is loaded. Because we need that value in order to differentiate things on the server, which button was actually which checkbox was actually being sent. We can see here by default the value is always on. That's the one that's used here. And we need to change that value, of course, in order to know on the server, hey, is now that the BMW series the 5, or is it the 6, or is it the 7, X5, or whatever it is. So we need to use that value in order to know which one was actually being pressed once we are submitting the data. So this value is used, and therefore we cannot use it to pre-check a checkbox. Therefore the checked attribute is being used instead. And now once I reload the page, let me just reload it and let's send the data. Now we actually have not the on value anymore. We actually now have the crucial information which we need in order to know which checkboxes were checked. And same refers to the radio buttons. Right now, once we are sending things, then the radio button, all it's sent, it's being on, so we need to use that value there as well in order to know on the server, hey, is that now satisfied, is it dissatisfied, or is it neutral, whatever we are dealing with, to stick with the example that's going on here, how satisfied are you with the company. So that is what we need to pay attention to. And now the last comment is in regards to the select menu, and that is for the value, for the select, which we also always send to the server. And here the name is given to the select, the value itself is given to the option. And if we do not supply any value here for the value attribute, then by default whatever selected content, the content of the selected option will be sent over to the server. But usually and most often we want to change that value. Often it is the case that those options are coming from a database. And when we store things inside a database, then each option has a number as well. So it's just much more easier to work with numbers. We already know on the server, the number 34 is the Bing website. So we have that idea anyway. So that's why we usually actually send numbers over to the server when working with such select option menus. And that's the reason why this value is being used here. We cannot use it to use it for the content. We need to have the option to give it a different value. Why the value attribute here down here is used for the content, it doesn't need to be specified as the content, for which this option element is a self-closing element when we are using it in conjunction with a data list. So that is it. Now let's just take a look for next week. Since we are actually now done basically in HTML, there are a few things left, a couple of global attributes. Then we are taking a look at link, meta, and our anchor. But otherwise we are done in HTML and we are moving into CSS now to finish up our first part of this course, the HTML and CSS part. And what we are left with basically is positioning. That's almost the entire time we will now be working on positioning, different layout options, a new layout option, flex layout we will be taking a look at. So that's left now in this course before we are finishing up and have our final week. And one more comment I want to make, I actually did a different structure now here. Here are our HTML content. We always select them as usual. Then we give them their dimensions, how they shall be positioned. We give them their stylistic appearance, how they shall look like stylistically. And now I changed this one actually away from how we want them to, what functionality we want our elements to have. So instead of transformations being down here, there are now different properties that we have seen now, including counter, increment, and reset. It's actually functionality. It's just more accurate. and transformations I have put under positioning, since actually that is positioning. So I just changed it a little bit to be a little bit more accurate, even though there is no foolproof accuracy. We can see it on other websites as well. It's just how we want it to be in general. Since background, for example, we can also position things here. So, but just to keep it as simple at least as possible. So that's why we are following the structure, in my opinion at least. So that is what's next week, and that was this week. So it's positioning. That's what we are left with.